A quiet morning in Savannah, just another stop or so, they thought. When a cop slams a black woman against a wall in broad daylight, he thinks he's asserting control. What he doesn't know, she's not just any woman, she's a high-ranking FBI agent, with the power to shake the very foundation he stands on. What unfolds next isn't just a confrontation, it's a storm of truth, silence shattered, and karma delivered in full. So sit back, because this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because stories like this deserve to be heard. It was supposed to be just another quiet morning, the kind where the air still carries the softness of dawn and the streets of downtown Savannah echo only the sound of footsteps and the low hum of distant traffic. Rochelle Turner, in her beige trench coat and comfortable walking shoes, stepped out of a small independent bookstore tucked between a bakery and a pawn shop, cradling a second-hand novel in one hand and a bottle of spring water in the other. The sky was a soft, hazy blue tinged with gold near the horizon, and the sidewalk still glistened faintly from an early mist that had not yet fully burned away. She had the look of someone who had finally allowed herself a day to breathe. No mission files, no briefings, no suits or security clearance cards clipped to her waist. She was just a woman walking alone, breathing in the salt-tinged air of the coastal city she'd once visited as a child and had returned to now for reasons she wasn't allowed to put into words. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did on quiet mornings like this, toward her father, and the sermons he used to whisper in her ear like secrets meant only for her, "Never forget who you are, but never expect the world to know what that means." She smiled faintly at the memory, crossing toward the curb, when something caught her eye, a ripple in the calm, a scene unraveling just 30 feet ahead in front of the corner market. Two police officers stood next to a black teenage boy, no older than 17, who was pressed chest first against the hood of a patrol car, his hands trembling slightly as one of the officers rifled through his backpack. The boy's voice was low, inaudible from where Rochelle stood, but his posture was telling he wasn't resisting, only trying not to flinch. The taller officer gripped his shoulder a little too hard, and the other kept glancing around as if daring someone to intervene. For a moment, Rochelle stood still, her body caught in that invisible tug between instinct and protocol, between the life she led publicly and the one she lived internally, shaped by years of watching young black boys disappear into systems that were designed to forget them. She stepped forward slowly but deliberately, her heels clicking softly against the concrete. "Excuse me, officers," she said, her voice calm but firm, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command a room. One of the officers glanced at her with irritation, the other barely acknowledged her at all. "Is there a reason this young man is being detained?" she asked, maintaining eye contact with the taller cop, who now stood to his full-height, lips curling in distaste. "You got business here, ma'am," he said, deliberately ignoring her question, as if the mere sound of her voice offended him. Rochelle didn't back down. She placed her bag under her arm and pointed subtly at the boy. "I saw him walk in and out of that store with nothing in his hands. He hasn't done anything wrong, and he doesn't appear to be resisting." The officer stepped closer, too close, close enough for her to smell the faint hint of coffee on his breath and the stale polyester scent of his uniform jacket. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but unless you're his mother or his lawyer, I suggest you keep walking." His voice had dropped to something grittier, more dangerous, not loud but laced with the kind of anger that didn't like to be questioned. Rochelle's posture didn't shift, but inside her muscles coiled instinctively, not out of fear but readiness. She had faced war criminals and domestic arms dealers. She had interrogated trained killers and broken open corruption cases that spanned years and continents. But what stood before her now wasn't foreign, wasn't extraordinary. It was a man with a badge, who thought power meant never having to explain himself. She could have walked away. It would have been smarter, safer, cleaner. But Rochelle Turner had never been built for silence. She took a breath, subtle but grounding. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly, "and someone needs to tell you before you turn it into something worse." That was the moment the boy looked up just briefly, and for a split second their eyes met. He didn't say a word, but his face said everything. Fear, shame, confusion, and something else, hope, fragile and fleeting but unmistakable. Rochelle had seen that look before. In different faces, different cities, but always the same message: please don't walk away. She heard the officer's footsteps before she saw the motion, sudden and sharp, as he stepped forward and raised a hand toward her shoulder. The air seemed to compress, the sounds of the street fading into a quiet tension as his fingers tightened. "Don't you touch me," she said quietly, but the warning went unheard. The world tilted for a moment, not physically, but morally, as the officer's hand gripped her arm and shoved her back, pinning her body against the coarse brick wall of the market, his forearm pressing against her chest just below her throat. Her novel dropped to the ground with a soft thud, its spine cracking. Pedestrians gasped, a car slowed in the street, and somewhere a phone began recording. But Rochelle didn't struggle. She didn't scream or plead. Her eyes locked with his, and she spoke with the kind of terrifying calm only someone with nothing left to prove could wield. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said. And though her voice barely rose above a whisper, it cut through the scene like a blade through fabric. The officer scoffed, not yet realizing who she was or what she represented. But Rochelle had already filed this moment away, not as trauma, but as evidence. And in that pause, in that breath between action and consequence, the stillness settled around her like armor, not the end of something, the beginning. The officer didn't even bother turning fully to face her. His eyes flicked sideways, jaw clenched, voice sharp with rehearsed contempt as he barked, "Back the hell off, lady." He said it like a reflex, not out of surprise but irritation, the way someone might swat away a fly that landed on their sleeve, annoyed that it dared to exist near him. Rochelle didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Her posture remained level, her breath measured, and her voice, when it came, was calm but pointed. "You're violating his rights," she said, gesturing to the boy, still being held against the patrol car. "He's not resisting, and you know it." The younger officer paused for a second, visibly uncertain, but the one gripping the boy didn't break stride. He just kept going, pressing harder into the teenager's back with a hand that had done this more times than he could remember, each motion born of muscle memory and unchecked power. That was when Officer Darren Stokes finally turned toward her, his full weight pivoting, as if responding to a deeper challenge, something unspoken that tightened the air around them. He looked her up and down with a sneer that didn't need words, his eyes calculating, dismissive already, writing a version of the story in his head where she was the problem and he was the man who shut her down. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, not because he didn't want the answer, but because he was already sure he knew it. "You think just 'cause you talk pretty and wear that coat like it means something, you can walk up and tell me how to do my job?" His voice carried a weight that wasn't volume, it was venom, a practiced dominance that didn't rely on law or facts, just the certainty that no one had ever made him answer for this tone before. Rochelle said nothing for a breath, just looked at him steady still, like a mirror refusing to move. Inside, a familiar calculation unfolded. She could flash her badge and shift the dynamic instantly. But that wasn't the choice that mattered right now. The test wasn't whether he would respect her rank. It was whether he could recognize basic humanity without needing to be told it wore a title. "I'm telling you to stop," she said again, her voice. "Even not because I have to, but because you should." Stokes stepped closer, now inches away, his breath sharp with bitterness and morning coffee. "Lady," he growled low and deliberate, "stop talking, turn around and get back in your car." Behind them, the city moved on, as if this moment wasn't burning through concrete, the sound of tires rolling over puddles, birds overhead, a woman pushing a stroller around the corner, unaware that history was tightening its grip on a side street no one had cared much about before. Rochelle held her ground, feet planted, spine straight. Her heart wasn't racing, it never did in moments like these. What she felt instead was the weight of every past encounter, just like this one. The teacher who called her aggressive at 9 years old for asking too many questions, the officer who questioned her right to be on Capitol Hill because her ID photo didn't match his idea of authority, the colleagues who smiled too tightly and always spoke to her title instead of her name. So when Stokes reached for her quick and practiced, his fingers clamping down around her wrist with more pressure than protocol, allowed, her body instinctively shifted into awareness, not fear but readiness. The world shrank down to the space between his chest and hers as he jerked her arm behind her and slammed her shoulder into the brick wall of the store, the same wall someone had once painted with the words, "We belong here," in fading red. Spray paint. His forearm pressed into her collarbone, pinning her back, his face just inches from hers, eyes burning with the thrill of control. "You want to be part of this too, huh?" he hissed, as if her very presence was a crime. "Should have stayed in the damn car." The boy in handcuffs turned wide-eyed and frozen. The younger officer hesitated again, glancing between his partner and the woman being pinned, clearly unsure whether this was still procedure or something else entirely. A few feet away, someone gasped, and a phone clicked into recording mode. But no one stepped in. No one spoke. Because moments like this move too fast, and silence was always the safest side to take when power looked like a uniform and authority looked like a threat. Rochelle didn't struggle. She didn't raise her voice or demand to be released. She knew exactly what would happen if she did, how easily the narrative could shift, how quickly a crowd could be convinced that compliance had somehow failed to arrive in the proper tone or posture. Instead, she met his stare with the quiet certainty of someone who'd been here before and would never be here again. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but loaded with so much gravity it seemed to tilt the sidewalk beneath them. For a beat he didn't react, just stared confused, waiting for the reaction he expected, panic, pleading defiance. Instead he got stillness, the kind that doesn't yield, doesn't cry, doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind that terrifies men like him more than anything. Because he hadn't just grabbed a woman. He'd grabbed a reckoning. He let her go after a moment, but not before squeezing her wrist one last time hard enough to send a dull ache radiating up her arm. The younger officer mumbled something, maybe that was too much, but Stokes didn't reply. Rochelle straightened her coat, calmly brushed dust from her shoulder, and picked up her book from the pavement, its spine now creased, its cover torn. She didn't say another word, didn't offer a badge, didn't make a scene. She just walked back toward her car like nothing had happened, like she wasn't filing every second into a place deeper than memory. Because this moment wouldn't be forgotten, and it wouldn't be forgiven, not in headlines, not in courtrooms, not in the soft comfort of silence. She opened her car door, sat down behind the wheel, and closed her eyes for a long second, letting the tension settle like sediment in deep water. Not because she was shaken, but because she knew what came next. And even though she hadn't chosen this confrontation, she recognized it for what it was, the final puzzle piece falling into place, the match striking dry tinder. Then she turned the key in the ignition, the engine hummed, and the street resumed its indifferent rhythm. Just another morning in Savannah. But Rochelle knew the air had shifted, even if no one else did. And as she pulled away, the image of Stokes standing in the middle of the sidewalk, still glaring, still clueless, still proud, burned into her mind like the beginning of a story she had no intention of leaving unfinished. The moment his arm left her chest and the pressure against her collarbone faded, Rochelle took a small step back, not stumbling, not flustered, just reclaiming the space that had been violently taken from her seconds before. The brick wall behind her still radiated the day's heat, but her skin felt cold beneath the fabric of her coat, the lingering imprint of his forearm an invisible reminder of how quickly dignity can be dismissed. She straightened the sleeve he had crushed, slow and deliberate, then bent to retrieve her book from the cracked sidewalk fingers, grazing the torn corner of the cover, like touching something too fragile to fix. Around her, the world resumed its rhythm, cars crawling by, a woman watching from a nearby bus stop with her phone still recording, and the young boy still in handcuffs, shoulders trembling but eyes locked on hers. Rochelle didn't look at Stokes again, didn't offer a final glare or parting threat. She didn't need to. The weight of what had just happened didn't require her confirmation to be real. Instead, she spoke with precision voice, quiet but unmistakable. "Let him go," she said, not as a plea, not as a request, but as an order carved from something older than policy. The younger officer, uncertain and increasingly pale, shifted his stance. She didn't do anything," he mumbled, as if realizing it too late, as if only now considering that maybe force should follow reason and not the other way around. Stokes waved him off with a grunt, his posture hardening, ego wrapping itself tighter like a shield. She interfered with a lawful stop, he snapped, but his voice had lost a measure of its force, like a door, slamming that no longer felt solid. Rochelle turned without waiting for more, walking back to her car in silence, her heartbeat not racing but steady, cold, almost too calm. The stillness inside her wasn't numbness, it was clarity, the kind that came not from fear but from recognition. She had seen men like Stokes before in courtrooms, in reports in whispers from victims who didn't have cameras or badges or people who believed them. But this time she had not only seen him, she had been seen by him in the worst way, reduced by him to something beneath consideration, not a threat, not an agent, just another body he could push against a wall without consequence. As she opened the door to her vehicle and slid into the driver's seat, she paused for a single beat, resting her hands on the steering wheel without turning the key. Her left wrist ached slightly from where he'd grabbed it, but it was a distant ache buried beneath something sharper, more pressing. There were no tears, no fury, no collapse. Only the quiet weight of a truth she'd always known and now had etched into her skin like a second signature. They don't care who you are until they're forced to. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror, not to fix anything but to hold her own gaze. The reflection stared back without blinking, without shaking a face, shaped by discipline, by duty, by the long, hard labor of restraint. For a moment, she let her eyelids close, breathing in through her nose, letting the air settle low in her chest, grounding her in the moment, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a witness. Then she reached into the side pocket of her coat and pulled out a small notepad, the kind she always carried, even on her days off, and with careful, unfaltering strokes began to jot down everything: time, location, officer's name, badge number, a description of the use of force, names of possible witnesses, the position of the sun, the direction of the breeze, the echo of a young boy's breathing against the hood of a police car. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about truth, and truth required record. As she wrote, her hands didn't tremble, but her jaw clenched slightly, not from rage, but from the sheer exhaustion of having to document what should never have happened. She'd spent years building cases, structuring airtight narratives to hold corrupt systems accountable. But she had never intended to become part of her own file. She flipped the notepad closed, slid it back into her pocket, and finally turned the ignition. The engine rumbled to life steady and low, and Rochelle pulled away from the curb like someone who wasn't running from anything but simply moving forward one frame at a time. In her rearview mirror she could still see the officers. The boy was now sitting in the back of the squad, car head bowed but still glancing toward where she'd stood. Officer Stokes paced the sidewalk with a forced casualness that didn't reach his shoulders. His eyes darted toward bystanders, scanning for threats, for consequences, for evidence that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Rochelle didn't smile. She didn't speak aloud. But inside her mind, one sentence rang clear, not as vengeance, but as prophecy. "You just gave me everything I needed." She turned onto the main road, merging with traffic, her eyes scanning forward, her mind already working through timelines, contact chains, jurisdiction protocols. She didn't need to retaliate. She didn't need to confront. All she needed to do now was proceed. Quietly, precisely, unstoppably. And as she drove through the heart of Savannah, past brick buildings and rusted mailboxes and children chasing one another across cracked sidewalks, the sun angled behind her and stretched her shadow long across the asphalt. It followed her like memory, like proof, like something unshakable. And in that moment she didn't feel rage or fear or the need to speak. What she felt was certainty, the kind of certainty that settles in your bones like weather before a storm. Because what happened back there wasn't just a bad moment, and it wasn't just a mistake. It was permission, and he'd given it freely. She didn't slam the car door or peel away with screeching tires. Instead, Rochelle eased into traffic as if nothing had happened, but every movement she made was a choice, deliberate and razor-sharp. The city flowed past her window in slow-motion, oak trees draped in Spanish moss, cracked sidewalks bearing witness to 1,000 quiet injustices, and the soft chatter of a woman leading her child across a crosswalk like this day was like any other. But inside the car it was different. Inside the car, Rochelle Turner was no longer an off-duty agent on a casual morning errand. She was something else entirely, now watchful, activated, and quietly, dangerously certain. She turned onto East Broxton Avenue, a long stretch lined with corner shops and faded murals, her fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel as she played those words back in her mind. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." It hadn't been a threat, it had been a diagnosis. The truth was, she hadn't meant to say it out loud, but once the words left her lips, she realized they weren't for him, they were for her. They were the release valve on a pressure that had been building for months, maybe years, and now that the air had been let out, she could see the structure underneath for what it really was. She thought about the way he had looked at her, unbothered, arrogant, convinced that the world would bend the moment he barked. Not even curious who she was. Not even interested in the possibility that someone standing in front of him might have power without needing to show it. She pulled into a quiet parking lot behind an old stone library and let the engine idle. The sun had climbed higher now, casting a harsh glare through the windshield that made her eyes squint as she sat motionless, staring at nothing and everything all at once. For a few minutes she just breathed, letting the silence inside the cabin press against her skin like water against glass. Her body ached in places she wouldn't admit, not from the force alone, but from restraint, from the way she had forced her muscles to remain still when every nerve had screamed to push back. She could have unholstered her badge, declared her title, shattered his smugness in a heartbeat, but she hadn't, she didn't, because this moment wasn't about asserting identity, it was about exposing character, and what she saw in him was exactly what she needed. Her phone buzzed softly on the seat beside her, and without looking she already knew the name that would be on the screen: Special Agent Charles Daniels, her direct supervisor, the only person in the bureau who knew the full extent of what she'd been building. She let it ring twice before answering, pressing the phone to her ear with a slow, steady hand. "It happened," she said, simply not bothering with context. Daniels didn't ask. His voice was low-edged with caution. "How bad?" Rochelle leaned her head back against the seat, watching a squirrel dart across the lot toward a cluster of garbage bins. "He put his hands on me," she replied. "Full force. Witnesses. Cameras." I didn't stop him. There was a pause, a stretch of static that felt like breath being held. "You okay?" he asked finally, and this time she heard something real in the question, not procedure but concern. "I'm fine," she said, and meant it. "This is what we were waiting for. It's time." Daniels exhaled the sound faint through the line. "You sure you want to go forward this way? We can pull the trigger, officially bring in IA, now leverage what we have." Rochelle turned her head slowly toward the dashboard, where the light from outside flickered through a crack in the glass, turning dust motes into gold. "No," she said, calm but firm. "If we do that, we get him, maybe 2 others. The rest scatter. They lawyer up. They disappear." Silence returned on the line, thoughtful, this time not hesitant. "So what do you need from me?" he asked. Rochelle tapped the back of her fingers against her thigh, her mind already layering the next steps like blueprints in motion. "Let it breathe. Don't call the precinct yet. I need to build the angle tighter, run those names again through the sealed records, pull the suspended complaints, especially anything that matches his patrol schedule over the last 6 months. And get me the transcript from that settlement 2 years ago, Kennedy, the one with the missing footage." Daniels grunted in acknowledgement. "You're not playing chess anymore, Turner. This is something else." "I'm not playing anything," she said. "I'm documenting gravity." When the call ended, she set the phone down without a second glance, and rolled the window down halfway. The air that drifted in was thick with heat and distant traffic, but also something quieter, like the murmur of a city that hadn't realized, yet it was about to be held accountable. She stared out over the parking lot for another moment, then opened the glove compartment, and pulled out a slim black folder, labeled only with a date. Inside were pages of names, photos, incident numbers, redacted reports that had been reconstructed over months of patient digging. At the top of the second page was his name, Stokes, Darren A., already highlighted in yellow. She slid the folder into her satchel, clipped the buckle, and placed it on the passenger seat beside her, its weight suddenly heavier than it had been that morning. But it wasn't burden, she felt it was traction. A firm footstep against loose gravel. A clear signal that she wasn't guessing anymore. The gears had shifted. Before pulling away, she glanced once more at her reflection in the rearview mirror, not with vanity but with resolve. The swelling in her wrist would fade. The memory of his laugh would not. But neither would the sound of her own voice, calm and unwavering, speaking the truth aloud in the face of someone too small to recognize it. And as the car eased back onto the road, and the buildings resumed their slow parade, she allowed herself one thought, just one. He gave me everything without realizing he'd handed over the match and the fuse. Then she drove forward quiet and sure into the center of a city that had no idea its silence had just been broken. The noise came in waves, gasps, muttered curses, a voice calling out, "Hey!" from across the street, but no one stepped forward, and that silence, thick and familiar, settled around the corner store like an invisible curtain. The boy was still pinned to the hood of the patrol car, his face partially turned toward Rochelle, eyes wide and frozen, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. His lips parted slightly like he wanted to say something, maybe "thank you," maybe "are you okay," but nothing came out. Behind him, the younger officer hesitated, one hand still awkwardly holding the boy's backpack, the other twitching, like he wanted to undo what had just happened, but didn't know how to start. Rochelle, steady and measured, stood still for a breath longer than necessary, allowing her pulse to settle into rhythm again. Her ribs felt bruised where the wall had greeted her, and her wrist ached from the torque of Stokes's grip, but pain was the last thing on her mind. She didn't look at the officers again. She looked at the bystanders, the man holding his phone at chest level, the woman shielding her toddler's eyes, the delivery driver frozen in place halfway between truck and sidewalk. Each one held the same expression, concern diluted by helplessness, because they had all seen something but they didn't yet know what it meant or what would come of it. She turned without a word and walked back toward her car, slow but not sluggish, each step a refusal to be hurried. As she reached the driver's side, she heard a voice from behind, low and unsteady. Ma'am. Are you okay? It was the boy. His voice cracked slightly raw from the weight of adrenaline and the knowledge that he'd nearly been alone in it. Rochelle paused, resting one hand on the car roof, then turned just enough to meet his gaze. I'm fine, she said softly, but with intention. You're going to be okay too. He nodded, unsure whether he believed it, but held her eyes for another moment, as if trying to memorize the look on her face, the calm after chaos, the certainty he hadn't seen in anyone wearing a uniform before. Back in the car, Rochelle let her hands rest in her lap for a moment before reaching for her phone. She didn't open her contacts, didn't record anything yet. She just stared at the screen as her reflection stared back, muted by glass, shadowed by sun. She looked older in that angle, more tired than she remembered feeling. But it wasn't fatigue, it was awareness. The kind that seeped in after something irreversible had taken place, when you knew life wasn't broken but realigned, tilted ever so slightly toward something that demanded reckoning. She finally moved, digging into her bag for the legal pad she carried everywhere, flipping to a blank page and beginning to write, not names, not accusations, just observations. She wrote down how the air had smelled, how the heat had baked the bricks until they pressed into her shoulder like fire, how the officer's expression hadn't changed even as he made contact. She wrote how the boy hadn't flinched when she stepped in, how the crowd had hovered but never closed in, how the younger officer's hand had twitched, like maybe, just maybe, he still remembered what restraint felt like. It wasn't just memory, it was evidence. Outside the windshield, the city moved again, taxis edging past people, checking their watches, a siren in the distance that didn't belong to this scene. But Rochelle wasn't thinking about the traffic or the pedestrians or the time. She was thinking about power and how it had shifted, not loudly, not publicly, but in a subtle crack of foundation that no one else seemed to hear. She'd spent most of her life moving through rooms where people underestimated her until it was too late. In those rooms, she learned the value of silence, not as submission, but as surveillance. She knew how to wait, how to watch, how to let someone hang themselves with their own certainty. That's what had just happened. And that's why she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't pulled her badge, hadn't fought back. Because this wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of a chain reaction, and she intended to let it fall one link at a time. A knock on the window pulled her back, soft but deliberate. She looked up and saw the woman from the sidewalk, the one with the toddler now standing near her car, holding her phone in both hands. Rochelle rolled the window down halfway, brows slightly raised. The woman spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. I recorded everything. If you need it, it's yours. Rochelle nodded once, no smile, just gratitude anchored in stillness. Thank you, she said, and took the phone when offered. The woman didn't stay, didn't explain, she just turned and walked back to her child, who now sat on the curb playing with a dandelion. Rochelle transferred the footage to her secure drive, in seconds, naming it only with the date and time. No embellishment, no commentary. The images would speak for themselves. She leaned back in her seat and let out a long breath, not a sigh of relief, but a release of calculation, of quiet strategy, forming beneath the surface like pressure before a tectonic shift. Her eyes drifted shut for a moment, and the world slowed to the rhythm of breath and memory. The boy's face, the officer's laugh, the silence of the crowd, the woman's outstretched hand. These were not moments. They were signals. And when Rochelle opened her eyes again, the light had shifted, the shadows stretched longer across the pavement, and everything around her felt one shade more exposed. She turned the key, the engine whispered to life, and the steering wheel felt solid in her grip. She didn't look back, not at the store, not at the officers, not at the crowd. She had what she needed, not just the video, not just the names, but but the final proof of who he really was when no one in power was watching. And as she pulled into traffic, merging with the city like another anonymous car in the blur of afternoon, she carried one thought like a secret held in both hands. Sometimes the most powerful evidence is what they think you didn't notice. He walked into the precinct like he always did, chin up, stride wide, the smug kind of confidence that comes from years of unchecked power wearing a badge. Darren Stokes didn't see the whispers, didn't feel the tension that had begun to settle into the walls like humidity after a storm. He just laughed louder than usual, slapped the vending machine like it owed him money, and dropped into the break room chair with that same lopsided smirk he wore the night he forced a man to the ground over a broken taillight. "That woman looked like she stepped out of a courtroom commercial," he said, shaking his head, "but she shut up quick when I pinned her." The others chuckled, one out of loyalty, one out of fear, and one because silence is easier than confrontation when the man sitting beside you has more stripes on his sleeve. Across the room, someone stirred their coffee without drinking it, staring down into the cup like it held a better version of the truth. Another officer cleared his throat but said nothing. Stokes didn't notice. He rarely did. He was already onto the next story, exaggerating her reaction, mocking her tone, mimicking her stance with the flair of someone who believed the theater of bravado could erase the reality of brutality. "Should have seen the look on her face," he said, dragging the words out like a punchline. Like she realized she'd messed with the wrong one. But the air didn't laugh with him. It stayed still heavy. And for the first time in years, the stillness felt like it was watching back. Rochelle, meanwhile, wasn't in her office. She wasn't at her apartment. She was in a quiet federal building downtown, its windows double-glazed, its doors guarded not by men with guns but by protocols with clearance levels. She sat in a soundproof room with the lights dimmed, a cup of untouched tea at her elbow, and a government-issued tablet in her hands playing a 12-second video on loop. Over and over, it replayed the moment he slammed her against the wall, the shove, the grip, the sneer, and her voice steady as steel. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." She didn't flinch as she watched it, didn't pause or skip or wince. She was listening not to the violence but to the silence after the split second, when he laughed like nothing mattered, not even consequences. The door creaked, and Daniels leaned in, his voice softer than usual. "You sure you still want to do this your way?" he asked. Rochelle didn't look up. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a beat before she pressed pause. "There's no other way that gets all of them," she said. "Not just him. The whole network." Daniels exhaled through his nose, ran a hand over his beard, and nodded slowly. "We're with you," he said, "but patience doesn't keep you safe forever." Rochelle turned her gaze to the screen again. "I'm not looking for safe," she said. "I'm looking for clean." Back at the precinct, Stokes noticed something odd for the first time. His captain passed him in the hallway without a word, eyes fixed on some far-off point that had nothing to do with him. A stack of case files on his desk had been marked with post-it notes that weren't his handwriting. The department's internal affairs officer, who usually showed up only for formal briefings, lingered too long near the bullpen, pretending to check emails on a tablet that never left the home screen. Still, Stokes brushed it off. He'd seen this dance before: internal politics, petty rumors, new recruits trying to climb over old ones. He wasn't worried. Not yet. But that night, when he got home and pulled his phone from his pocket, he noticed 3 missed calls from an unknown number and 1 voicemail that started with static and ended with a voice that simply said, "You were seen." He didn't sleep well, blamed it on the mattress. Told himself he was just tired. But the next morning, when he walked into the precinct and the room got a little too quiet, a little too fast, something shifted behind his eyes. And still, he didn't know. Rochelle was already moving, quietly, relentlessly. Her nights were filled with cross-referencing patrol logs, compiling complaints, tracing reports that had been filed, and then erased, rewritten, or buried under vague justifications. She didn't need fireworks or headlines. She needed patterns. And the pattern was clear. Stokes wasn't just a violent cop, he was a protected one, a man whose name had been flagged and then conveniently forgotten year after year under supervisor after supervisor. At 2:17 a.m. she finished a spreadsheet with 37 incidents, all falling within the same radius, involving young black men or women, most without charges, many without documentation. She saved the file, attached it to a sealed report, and sent it to Daniels with the subject line, "Here's your iceberg. He's just the tip." And then she sat back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes closed, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside the sealed windows. The pressure wasn't gone, but it was changing shape. Not fear, not anger. Something more exact, like a scalpel pressed to skin, not to wound but to reveal what was hidden underneath. She opened her eyes and whispered to no one, "Let's see if they still laugh tomorrow." And just like that, the silence became a countdown. By the time sunrise stretched thin shadows across the marble floors of the federal field office, Rochelle was already on her third cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on a dry erase board cluttered with names, arrows, and post-its, each one representing a thread she had pulled over the last 18 months. The office was quiet, too early for phones to ring or footsteps to echo, and in that hush she found clarity, not comfort, not calm, but a rare kind of precision that only came after months of carrying truths too dangerous to say aloud. This wasn't just about Stokes anymore. He was never the real objective, just another symptom with a uniform and a temper. What she was chasing now was bigger, an entire ecosystem of silence, where reports were edited, complaints were rerouted, and justice was treated like a threat. She stood back from the board arms, cross-jaw tight, rereading a timeline she had mapped and remapped dozens of times. There were patterns so clear now it was hard to believe no one had seen them before. Officers who always showed up first, cameras that always malfunctioned, suspects who always looked the same. And at the center of it, like a stone dropped into still water, was Stokes' radiating consequences with every incident that had once slipped through the cracks. She'd hesitated for weeks, not out of fear but strategy. Timing mattered. Proving too much too soon would only tip off the ones still hiding behind the paperwork. Daniels walked in without knocking, a paper bag in one hand, and 2 folders under his arm, his tie loosened like he'd never bothered to tighten it properly. "You look like you've been here all night," he said, setting the coffee down on her desk. Rochelle gave a tired nod, not quite a smile. "I left for 2 hours. Didn't help." He raised an eyebrow, flipping one of the folders open. "You said you needed a flashpoint," he said, his tone dipping toward caution, something undeniable. Rochelle gestured to the board without looking at it. "He gave it to me. On camera. With witnesses." She paused, then added, "And he laughed after." "That laugh's going to follow him into every hearing." Daniels leaned against the edge of the desk, flipping pages without urgency. "You ready for the blowback? Because the moment we move, they'll come fast and loud, legal teams, union reps, politicians who'd rather pretend they didn't know." Rochelle picked up a marker and circled a name on the board, an officer who had resigned mid-investigation 2 years ago, name buried in a settlement. "They'll come," she said, "but they'll be chasing shadows. I've already moved the case offshore. Nobody's touching this but my team." The words hung between them for a moment, thick with implication. She hadn't come this far to let a technicality derail what had taken years to build. Every document had been verified twice, every timestamp matched against patrol logs, every photograph watermarked and backed up in triplicate. But still, the real threat wasn't evidence. It was the culture she was about to fracture. And cultures, unlike criminals, didn't go quietly. Daniels finally nodded, placing the folder down gently. "You get one shot at exposing this kind of rot," he said, voice low. "Make sure when it breaks it doesn't just bruise, it bleeds." Rochelle capped the marker and placed it on the ledge. "It will," she said. "This isn't just exposure, it's extraction." She turned back toward her desk, picking up a sealed envelope she'd been sitting on for days. Inside were names of officers protected by internal referrals, men and women who had been flagged but never disciplined, shuffled between precincts like cards in a crooked game. Her fingers grazed the edge of the flap, but she didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. What she didn't know, what she couldn't predict, was how far they would go to keep those names buried. Outside the building, the city was beginning to wake. Streetlights flickered off one by one, replaced by the glow of storefronts opening and buses grinding down narrow lanes. Inside the office, the silence was slowly replaced by voices, footsteps, and the dull hum of machinery coming to life. Rochelle looked out through the window, watching as a jogger passed by earbuds, oblivious to the fact that a reckoning was being assembled in the very building he just ran past. She took a sip of coffee, still bitter, still hot, and allowed herself one moment, just one, to feel the weight of what was about to happen. Not the fear, not the risk, the purpose. Because when the first domino fell, it wouldn't just be Stokes, it would be the culture that protected him, the offices that overlooked him, the system that had built him. And this time, there would be no room to look away. She turned from the window and picked up her phone. A single message blinked on the screen unread. It was from a retired officer. a whistleblower she'd spent weeks convincing to talk. The message was short. "I'm in. I'll testify." Rochelle stared at the words for a moment, then locked the phone and placed it face down on the desk. The line had held. The silence had cracked. And somewhere Stokes was still telling stories he didn't realize had already turned into evidence. She didn't feel victorious. Not yet. But she did feel something colder, clearer, like the edge of a blade finally honed after years of grinding. And when she picked up her pen again, it was not to write down what had happened, but to draft what came next. Because this wasn't just a case, it was a blueprint. And justice, real justice, never began with fire, it began with facts. And facts were something she had in abundance. The storm didn't announce itself with thunder or wind. It crept in quietly through glances that lingered too long, through names whispered behind closed doors, through the sudden weight of small changes that most people would miss. At Eastwood Precinct, the usual rhythm still played out, coffee brewing in the break room, dispatch chatter spilling through radios, boots thudding against tile. But there was something else in the air now, something unspoken and thick like the smell of metal before lightning hits. Conversations slowed when certain names were mentioned. Officers glanced at each other with a flicker of doubt. And somewhere in that building, behind one of those identical doors with peeling numbers and uneven blinds, someone knew it had finally begun. Rochelle sat in her temporary field office across town, surrounded by boxes stacked 3 high with redacted files, and old evidence logs, a half-eaten sandwich on the desk beside her untouched. She wasn't watching the storm roll in. She was directing it. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, cross-referencing badge numbers with sealed settlements, matching patrol logs to neighborhood complaints, building a pattern so intricate it looked like a web. She paused occasionally to sip lukewarm tea, her eyes never leaving the screen, her breath steady. The work was exacting, methodical, and deeply personal, not because it was her case, but because it was her home, and she was done letting it rot under silence. Across the city, Chief Elise Monroe opened a file she had been dreading for weeks, her eyes scanning a list of complaints that had once been deemed unsubstantiated, now under review with federal oversight. She was no stranger to bureaucracy or internal politics, but something about the file in front of her made her chest tighten. Names. She recognized incidents she'd been told were handled patterns. She'd allowed herself to stop questioning. Years ago, she picked up the phone not out of duty but guilt, and dialed Rochelle's direct line. The voice on the other end was calm. "I figured I'd hear from you today," Rochelle said without preamble. Elise exhaled, weary. "They're circling," she said. "My inbox is full of warning signs dressed up as updates. IA won't say it outright, but they're preparing for fallout." There was a pause, just long enough for discomfort to stretch between them. "I need to know what's coming," Elise added quietly, almost like a confession. Rochelle didn't offer comfort. "What's coming is accountability," she said, "and I need you to decide if you're going to brace for it or help shape it." Elise closed her eyes for a moment, fingers tightening around the edge of her desk. She had spent decades believing in the structure of the badge, the honor of the oath, even when it asked her to ignore the things that didn't fit. "If I give you full cooperation," she asked, "do I get to walk out of this with my name intact?" Rochelle didn't lie. "No," she said. "But you might walk out with your integrity. That's rarer." And with that, the line went silent again, not out of hostility but understanding. At the same time, Rochelle's team had begun pulling surveillance from traffic cams and storefront security systems that lined the blocks where Officer Stokes and his regular partners were known to patrol. What they found wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. Stops that lasted too long. Civilians pushed just outside the frame, reports filed hours after incidents occurred. All of it subtle, just enough to blend in, just enough to vanish under paperwork. She watched a clip 3 times, eyes narrowing at the way Stokes leaned into the window of a sedan, his left hand hovering near his belt, while his right held a flashlight that wasn't on. The driver, a woman in her 40s, didn't move. She didn't protest. She didn't speak. But her face, Rochelle couldn't forget it. That tension, that quiet compliance carved from fear, not guilt. A look she'd seen in too many courtrooms and too many mirrors. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, casting golden stripes across the windowsill where a file folder sat unopened. The city was glowing in that in-between hour, where everything looks beautiful and nothing feels safe. Rochelle reached for the file and opened it slowly, scanning another officer's name tied to Stokes's shift schedule, then another and another. Each name was a thread, each thread pulled a little tighter around the truth. She could feel the structure beginning to bend, not break yet, but close. She stood and walked to the window, letting her body stretch for the first time in hours, her reflection blending into the faint silhouette of the city behind glass. The streets below looked quiet, almost peaceful, but Rochelle knew better. Peace was the lie they built to cover power. What she wanted wasn't peace. It was clarity. And now finally it was coming into focus. She watched a delivery truck park across the street, the driver hop out music, still playing faintly from the cabin. Life continued, as always. But within that life, someone had handed her a key. The only question left was whether the city was ready to see the lock it opened. Behind her, the office was still filled with the quiet hum of computer fans and paper waiting to be read. She turned back toward the desk, picked up her phone, and recorded a single sentence into the secure log, her voice steady, deliberate, initiating formal review of Eastwood internal incident logs, starting with shift pairing patterns. Then she sat back down, placed her hands on the keyboard, and typed the first word of a report she knew would not be forgotten. And as the cursor blinked quietly insistent on the next line, she allowed herself one clear, centering thought. This time, no one walks away without answering. The briefing came in the form of a routine email, nothing flashy, just a line of text nestled between mundane bulletins about fleet maintenance and department fund reallocations, but buried within that sea of standard updates was a name that made Darren Stokes stop cold. He had skimmed past it twice before realizing what he was looking at, and when he did, the air in the precinct suddenly felt thinner, like the room had tilted slightly on its axis. He reread the line 3 more times, each word pulling tighter around his throat. Federal Task Force assigned to Savannah jurisdiction, in coordination with DOJ, Civil Rights Division. Field Lead Special Agent Rochelle Turner. He stared at the screen without blinking, barely aware of the faint buzz of the coffee machine behind him, or the muted radio static bleeding from the dispatch office down the hall. For a few seconds, the background noise of the precinct faded into something distant and meaningless, overtaken by a rising pulse in his ears that made everything else sound muffled. She had a name now, a full name, not just a face pinned against a wall, not just a voice that had unnerved him more than he'd admitted. And suddenly all the things he had laughed off the recording phones, the boy in handcuffs, the way she hadn't fought back, rewound in his mind with a clarity that left his palms sweating. He didn't tell anyone he recognized the name. He didn't move. He just clicked the email closed and pushed his chair back, slowly standing up, like a man whose legs had started to remember how much weight they were carrying. Across the city, Rochelle already knew what was happening. She didn't need to be there to see it. The moment her name had entered the system, she expected calls would be made, whispers would spread, eyes would narrow behind office blinds. But that was the point. Transparency wasn't a tactic, it was a signal. She had worked too long in the shadows, too long gathering evidence that disappeared the moment light touched it. Now she wanted them to see her coming. She wanted them to feel the shift before they understood it. That afternoon she sat in a quiet conference room at the Department of Justice satellite office, the windows overlooking the Savannah River, where tugboats moved slow and stubborn under a gray-blue sky. Around the table were attorneys, data analysts, and policy liaisons, each one briefed on the file but not yet fully aware of how personal this case had become. Rochelle's voice was steady as she outlined the sequence of complaints, the disappearance of body cam footage, the pattern of arrests that ended without charges, but always left someone broken. "We're not just dealing with misconduct," she said, sliding a photo across the table. "We're dealing with a culture that incentivizes silence and punishes intervention." The room was quiet except for the soft hiss of the HVAC system. One of the attorneys leaned forward, brows furrowed. "Do you believe this goes beyond the precinct?" Rochelle didn't look up from her notes. "I don't believe anything anymore," she replied. "I document what I see. And what I've seen suggests this isn't isolated. It's institutional." Someone else shifted in their chair. "And the officer who assaulted you, does he know who you are now?" Rochelle finally looked up, meeting the question head on. "He does," she said. "And that's why the timing is perfect." Back at Eastwood, Stokes moved differently for the rest of the day. Not enough to draw attention, but enough for those who were watching to notice. His jokes were shorter. His laugh came slower. His hands tapped against the side of his holster more often, like a man waiting for a knock that hadn't yet come. He asked fewer questions during the afternoon debrief, skipped the locker room conversation entirely, and left the station 10 minutes earlier than usual without making eye contact. That night, Rochelle sat by the window of her apartment, the lights off, the soft hum of the city alive beneath her feet. She watched the street lamps flicker in intervals, one block at a time, and thought about the patterns again, not the ones in spreadsheets or incident reports, but the ones in behavior. How power reacts when it feels itself being observed. How arrogance folds into paranoia. How the strongest walls begin to crumble, not from force, but from fear. Her phone buzzed beside her. A text from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "You don't belong here. Walk away while you can." She stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without replying. Threats didn't scare her anymore. Silence did. She stood up, walked into her kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. Her wrist still ached faintly where he had grabbed her. Not bruised, not broken, just a small, persistent echo of that moment, a reminder that some pain lingers not because it hurts, but because it clarifies. And as she stood in the quiet of her home, surrounded by maps, transcripts, and boxes of evidence waiting to be filed, she didn't feel overwhelmed or exhausted or alone. She felt ready. Ready for what was next. Ready for the confrontation they thought she wouldn't dare initiate. Ready for the moment someone in uniform would ask why she'd come back, and she'd answer with no hesitation, "Because I never left." The invitation came in the form of a quiet knock at her office door, not urgent, not formal, just two gentle taps that seemed to hesitate before fading into the stillness of the hallway. Rochelle didn't look up immediately. She was mid-sentence, typing notes into a witness log, fingers moving steadily across the keys, as if they had memorized the rhythm of truth. When she finally turned, she saw Daniels standing there with his jacket still on a folder in his left hand, and a look on his face that gave away more than he intended. He wasn't here with updates or directives. He was here with weight. "We got someone," he said, simply holding up the file, "and he's ready to talk." She motioned for him to come in, her eyes narrowing slightly, as he set the folder down on the table between them. "Who?" she asked, voice low but expectant. Daniels opened the file, revealing a single sheet with a name written in clean block letters, Jalen Price. She blinked once, then twice. The name wasn't unfamiliar. She'd seen it years ago, buried in an internal memo about a sudden resignation following a departmental inquiry that conveniently went nowhere. "He's alive," she asked half to herself. Daniels nodded. "Living out of a motel off the interstate. Construction job. Said he's done staying quiet." Rochelle leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, her mind already running ahead to the questions she needed answered. Price wasn't just another name on the list. He was a missing piece, someone who had once stood inside the same walls. She was trying to bring down someone who had seen how the machine worked from the inside, and decided to walk away before it crushed him completely. That evening, she drove out to the edge of town where the city lights faded into empty roads and gas stations that closed early. The motel was quiet, lit by flickering neon, the kind of place where curtains stayed shut and silence filled the air like insulation. She found him in the far corner room door, cracked open just enough to show the light from inside. He was sitting at the table by the window, stirring a cup of coffee with a plastic spoon, not drinking it, just watching it swirl. He looked older than his file photo, thinner, wearier, like a man who'd been holding his breath for too many years. When she entered, he didn't stand, didn't offer his hand. "You're the one who got him to put his hands on her," he said, not accusingly, but with a kind of exhausted admiration. "That took guts." Rochelle sat down across from him, setting her recorder gently on the table without pressing play. "I didn't provoke him," she said. "He just did what he always does." This time people were watching. Price chuckled softly, a sound more bitter than amused. "Yeah, well, I watched him do worse." He reached into a small duffel bag beside his chair and pulled out a flash drive, setting it between them like it was made of glass. "I kept this," he said, "because I thought maybe one day someone would give a damn." Rochelle looked at it for a moment, then picked it up and tucked it carefully into her coat pocket. "Tell me what's on it," she said, but Price shook his head. "You'll see," he replied. "But I'll tell you this much, it's not just Stokes, it's the ones who protected him. The ones who told me to keep my mouth shut, take the suspension and let it go." The air in the room felt thicker now, like it carried the weight of memory and regret. Rochelle leaned forward slightly, her voice softer. "Why talk now?" Price rubbed his hand over his jaw, then stared out the window at nothing in particular. "Because I saw your face on the news. And because I saw that kid just standing there while that bastard shoved you like you didn't matter. And it hit me. I've been quiet too long. And silence doesn't protect anyone. But the ones doing the damage, They sat in that silence for a while, not out of discomfort but out of shared recognition. There were no speeches, no promises. Just the slow, careful beginning of something long overdue. When Rochelle finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. "They're going to come after you," she said. "When this gets out, they'll come hard." Price nodded, finally sipping the coffee he had stirred to death. "Let them," he said. "I'd rather they come for me knowing I told the truth than live another day helping them hide it." That night, Rochelle drove back through the city with the flash drive in her coat and 1,000 thoughts pulsing behind her eyes. The streets were mostly empty, the stoplights blinking yellow at deserted intersections, the rhythm of the city slowed to a whisper. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't check her messages. She just drove in silence, letting the weight of what she'd been handed settle into her bones like a storm forming behind her ribs. When she reached her building, she didn't go straight upstairs. She sat in her car for a while, watching the dark windows of the complex across the street, wondering how many other people inside were carrying secrets, how many were waiting for someone else to make the first move. She finally stepped out, the air cool and damp, her footsteps soft against the pavement. And as she reached the entrance, she thought of Price again, not just the man he had become, but the man he had tried not to be. And that thought settled into a single clear truth. Sometimes courage doesn't look like standing tall. Sometimes it looks like sitting down in a motel room and handing over the one thing you've been too scared to share. She took a breath, then disappeared into the stairwell, the door swinging shut behind her with a quiet, definitive click. The church basement smelled faintly of old wood and lemon cleaner, the kind of scent that lingered in places where community still mattered, where silence meant listening instead of fear. Folding chairs had been arranged in a wide circle under soft yellow lights, and the air buzzed with a quiet tension that wasn't quite anxiety but something close to anticipation. Rochelle sat near the far end, not centered, not leading, just watching the room fill one figure at a time, each carrying something unseen in their shoulders, something that didn't need to be named out loud to be understood. These weren't strangers, these were leaders, neighborhood pastors, school counselors, small business owners, retired officers, activists, and young people who had seen too much and were still willing to speak. They had all come because she'd asked, not with flyers or news headlines, but with phone calls, quiet conversations, and the truth she'd carried into every room since the moment she was pushed against that wall. There was no podium, no microphone, no formal greeting, just her voice even, and grounded as she stood slowly and looked around the circle. "What's coming next," she said, "is going to shake this city harder than anything it's seen in decades. Not because people don't already know the truth, but because they've never been asked to face it all at once." Her words didn't raise in volume, didn't perform, but they held the weight of someone who wasn't there to inspire. She was there to prepare. A woman in her 60s leaned forward, elbows on knees, her church pin glinting faintly under the light. "You think they're going to listen to us?" she asked, not skeptical, but tired. Rochelle nodded gently. "Maybe not at first, but they'll listen to the silence when it breaks." A young man, 2 chairs down, barely 20, with calloused hands and eyes that didn't blink, often shifted in his seat. "What do you need from us?" he asked, voice steady. Rochelle looked at him, then at the rest of them. "I need you ready," she said. "Ready to speak when the cameras come. Ready to protect the kids when the streets heat up. Ready to hold each other accountable when the pressure gets ugly." Someone else chimed in from the back, a pastor with kind eyes and a cracked voice. "We've been holding this together with duct tape and prayers for 20 years, he said, chuckling dryly. "You telling us it's finally going to fall apart?" Rochelle met his gaze and held it for a moment. "I'm telling you, we finally get to decide what it looks like when we rebuild it." The room grew quiet again, but this time it was thoughtful, not heavy. People sat with the words not rushing to fill the space, letting the possibility of real change settle into their bones slowly like warmth after cold rain. A mother near the doorway wiped her palms against her jeans and nodded. "Just don't let them spin this into another scare," she murmured. "We're tired of being someone else's headline." Rochelle offered the softest smile she'd worn in weeks. "Then let's make sure we tell the story ourselves." As the meeting wound down, people lingered, sharing contact info, writing notes, holding long glances that said more than handshakes ever could. Rochelle remained in her chair, letting the moment breathe, watching people reclaim a sense of ownership in a city that had taught them to survive by shrinking. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the weight of the truth was hers to carry alone. They were lifting it together in their own quiet ways, with questions and conviction, and the kind of resilience that didn't ask for permission to exist. Later that night, Rochelle walked back to her car under a sky heavy with low clouds, the street lamps flickering orange halos onto damp pavement. The air was thick with the smell of magnolia and warm concrete, and in the distance she could hear the faint hum of traffic winding through Eastwood like a restless river. She paused beside the car, one hand on the door handle, and took a long breath, not out of exhaustion but to feel the moment fully before it passed. Inside her coat pocket was a folded note card pressed into her hand by a high school teacher just before she left the meeting. On the front, in slanted handwriting, were 5 simple words: "We've got your back now." She held the card there for a moment, fingers brushing its edges, then slipped it into the sun visor above her head. As the car engine rumbled to life, Rochelle didn't think about strategy or outcomes or the next steps on the investigation timeline. She thought about that room, the half-circle of chairs, the layered voices, the collective decision to stand, even when standing came with risk. And as she pulled onto the road, the city didn't feel quite the same. It felt more awake, more watched, more alive. Not because the system had changed overnight, but because the people who had been surviving under it for years had finally decided to stop surviving quietly. And that shift, subtle but irreversible, was enough to tell her that the tide had turned. The news vans started arriving before sunrise, their antennas rising like awkward scaffolding into the damp Savannah skylights, flicking on in soft bursts that painted the courthouse steps in television glow. Reporters sipped coffee from paper cups huddled near tripods, reviewing names and cue cards with the same reverence reserved for breaking storms or scandal. A few had that nervous energy of knowing something big was coming, but not yet understanding its shape. And above them, on the 4th floor of a municipal building that had housed more secrets than justice, Rochelle stood at the window with her arms crossed, watching the city stretch and stir under the weight of what it was about to see. She didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't the word. There was no victory in exposing what should have been stopped years ago, no glory in revealing pain others had already lived through. What she felt was steadiness, a quiet, steel-wrapped calm that came not from certainty, but from preparation. The files had been delivered, the timeline was set. The press briefing scheduled for 10 o'clock would break the case open publicly, but Rochelle knew the real shift wouldn't come from microphones or headlines. It would come from the faces in the crowd, people who'd lived in silence for too long now, seeing themselves in something undeniable. In a side room down the hall, Chief Monroe sat at a long oak table, her hands folded tight, and still a silence hanging over her that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with reckoning. She had agreed after weeks of hesitation to speak after Rochelle. She'd read the report 3 times. She'd seen the names, many of them officers she had personally mentored, defended, or quietly transferred. And when she signed the statement acknowledging the department's failure, her pen hadn't trembled, but her heart had. At 9:53 a.m., Rochelle walked toward the briefing room, flanked by 2 DOJ staffers and a civil rights attorney who had once tried a police corruption case in Baltimore. Her heels echoed softly in the hallway, not rushed, not hesitant, but grounded, like each step had already been rehearsed in her body before her mind could catch up. She didn't carry notes, she didn't need to. Everything she was about to say had been written in her bones long before it ever made its way to paper. The podium was plain, the seal behind it polished the room, filled with folding chairs occupied by reporters, community members, a few council representatives, and scattered city employees trying not to look at one another too directly. Rochelle took her place in front of the microphones, adjusted the height once, and let the quiet settle before she spoke. There are stories, she began, that hide in systems for years, quietly, methodically feeding off the absence of accountability. Today we bring one of those stories into the light, not to punish for the sake of punishment, but to begin the work of repair. She didn't speak in sound bites. She spoke like someone unspooling a wire that had been wrapped too tightly for too long. She spoke of complaints dismissed, footage erased, people harmed but never heard. She spoke of patterns, the roots, the calls, the repeated names in black ink on redacted lines. And she spoke of silence, not just from officers, but from those who saw, suspected, or benefited, and said nothing. When she finished, the room didn't erupt into noise. It just exhaled. A long, collective breath from a body that had held too much tension for too many years. Chief Monroe followed. Her speech was shorter, more formal, but no less honest. She accepted responsibility for what had been allowed to fester. She didn't deflect or defend. She said the words clearly. We failed this city. We failed our people, and we're going to face the cost of that failure one name at a time. The Q&A that followed was restrained, focused. No one shouted. No one spun. Reporters asked about reforms, about charges, about timelines. Rochelle answered only what she could. The rest she promised would be made public in writing within the next 48 hours. Outside, the crowd that had gathered on the courthouse steps began to grow small at first. Then denser, a quiet hum building in the air like wind through trees. People held up photos. Some held signs. A few simply stood with their hands folded, eyes closed, as if bearing witness in stillness was their protest. Rochelle stepped out into that morning light not to make a statement, but to stand with them. No podium. No camera. Just her presence, grounded and human and visible. A woman approached her gray curls, pulled into a bun, eyes wet but bright. "My nephew," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He was one of them. The ones no one believed. Rochelle nodded slowly, not asking for more. The woman touched her hand briefly just once and said, "Thank you for making sure we're not invisible anymore." Rochelle didn't reply right away. She looked out over the crowd, letting the warmth of the sun land on her face, letting the sound of the people settle into her chest like rhythm. Then softly she said, "It was never about proving we were right. It was about proving we were real." And as the crowd stood in quiet defiance of a system that had pretended they didn't matter, Rochelle stepped down the courthouse, steps one slow, steady stride at a time, not leading, not following, just walking beside them, just part of them. The city didn't look different that day, but the silence that had once blanketed it like a shield had lifted, and in its place something heavier but truer had taken root. Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly through a crowd, looks you in the eye, and stays. The first confession didn't come during a press conference or in a courtroom. Under oath, it came late in the afternoon, in a quiet parking lot behind a grocery store, where a man sat in the back seat of an unmarked vehicle and stared straight ahead like he was trying to remember what it felt like to breathe without guilt. His name was Officer Leon Carter, and he'd worn the badge for nearly 17 years without incident. At least that's how the paperwork made it look. But Rochelle knew better. She'd seen the quiet edits, the unfiled complaints, the erased footage logs with his name printed faintly in the corner. What she hadn't expected, not entirely, was for him to ask for the meeting himself. He didn't look like a man ready to flip. He looked like a man unraveling slowly, one thought at a time. "You don't have to record this," he said, voice low, hands resting on his thighs like they belonged to someone else. Rochelle said nothing at first, letting the silence settle between them. She wasn't here to coax or pressure. She was here to listen, and when the truth came, she would know how to use it. He cleared his throat, eyes never meeting hers. "I saw the report," he said. "All the names, the timeline. And I realized if I wait any longer, I'll be the last one left standing in the wreckage." Rochelle folded her hands in her lap, her voice calm but steady. "Are you saying you were involved in misconduct, Officer Carter?" He let out a bitter half-laugh, more breath than sound. "Involved number, not directly. I didn't plant anything, didn't throw a punch I couldn't explain, but I saw it. All of it. And I never opened my damn mouth." The air inside the car grew still. The hum of the city in the distance felt louder now, as if trying to fill the space between his admission and the weight of what it meant. Rochelle waited, knowing better than to interrupt a man mid-fall. Stokes wasn't the only one, he continued. But he was the loudest, the most brazen. He thought getting away with it meant he was right. Thought nobody could touch him because nobody ever had. Carter shook his head slowly, lips pressed tight like he was fighting the instinct to swallow his own shame. "I knew about the locker room tapes, the ones they said got wiped. I saw the copies." Rochelle felt a shift in the room, not in her body but in the energy around them, as if the truth itself had taken form and pressed against the car's interior like steam. "Where are they now?" she asked, her tone, even almost soft. Carter blinked slowly, then looked at her for the first time. "I don't know. I gave them to a supervisor. Said I didn't want any part in it. He said he'd handle it." He paused. "That was 4 years ago." He made detective 2 months later. She didn't flinch. She didn't show the fire that began to rise in her chest. She just nodded slowly, letting him keep talking, letting the confession unspool at its own pace. "The kid from Jefferson Street," he whispered, barely audible. "The one who got tackled in the alley. They said he ran, but he didn't run. He just didn't understand what they were yelling. And when it was over, they laughed about it. In the locker room. like it was a game. Rochelle closed her eyes for a moment, not because she couldn't hear it, but because she could. Every word matched a file she had already read. Every name he mentioned was already circled in red on her board. But hearing it aloud from someone who had been there made it all sharper. Not more real, but more human. "I'm not asking for a deal," Carter said, looking down at his hands again. "I know what I let happen. I couldn't let this whole thing end with my silence being part of it." Rochelle leaned forward slightly, her eyes focused on his, her tone gentle. "Then don't let it end there. Make a statement. Come forward. Put your name to the truth and let it mean something." He didn't answer right away. His shoulders rose and fell with one long breath, the kind people take before walking into a storm they know they won't come out of the same. "I'll think about it," he said. "But you've got my word. I'll back whatever you need. I won't disappear." She nodded once slowly, then reached for the door handle, ready to give him the space he clearly needed. As she stepped out into the early evening light, the door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving him alone in that quiet capsule of memory and regret. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the concrete and turning the edges of buildings gold. Rochelle stood there for a moment, breathing it all in the truth, the sorrow, the strange weight of justice creeping closer, one confession at a time. And as she walked back toward her car, not hurried, not triumphant, she let a single thought settle into her bones. Sometimes the system doesn't collapse with noise. It unravels quietly, thread by thread, in the voice of someone who finally decides to stop looking away. It wasn't the moment Rochelle had expected to feel anything. It came without warning, without headlines, without applause. But as she stood on the back steps of the community center watching the last of the evening sun slip behind the buildings, she felt it settle inside her like the final piece of a puzzle that had taken years to find. The day had been a whirlwind: press calls, legal filings, policy meetings, reporters knocking gently but persistently for comment. But now, in the quiet dusk, she could hear the deeper pulse of something real shifting underneath the surface. It was in the way people looked at her now, not with awe, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet recognition, like they saw not just what she had done, but why she had done it. Down the street she could see DeAndre sitting on the curb outside the youth center, his elbows resting on his knees, his backpack slouched behind him like a burden he'd finally learned wasn't his to carry alone. He wasn't smiling, but he looked calm, eyes focused on the street, head slightly tilted, like he was listening for something beyond the traffic. She walked toward him slowly, her shoes clicking lightly against the pavement, the weight of the day still sitting in her joints like a residue that wouldn't scrub off. "You mind if I sit?" she asked, voice soft, steady. He shrugged, then nodded. "Sure," he said, almost like a question, as if still trying to figure out how to speak to people who didn't want something from him. Rochelle lowered herself onto the curb, wincing just slightly as her knees bent and rested her hands in her lap. They sat there for a while, not talking, just listening to the world wind itself down for the evening car doors, shutting a dog barking in the distance, the faint hum of an air conditioning unit chugging along one house over. Finally, he said, "I saw the news today, saw you on television. You looked serious." She smiled at that, not broadly, but enough for it to reach her eyes. "I was serious," she replied. "It's not every day you get to pull truth out of hiding." DeAndre nodded slowly, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "I didn't think anyone cared about what happened to me," he said, voice flat. "They made it feel like I was just in the way." Rochelle turned to look at him, not blinking, not softening what needed to be said. "You weren't in the way," she told him. "You were the reason I didn't walk away. You reminded me what's at stake." He didn't respond right away, just sat there digesting her words the way someone might roll a stone in their hand, feeling its edges before deciding whether to keep it or throw it away. "My mom said to stay quiet," he finally said. "Said that speaking up only brings more trouble. Said you don't win against them." Rochelle inhaled slowly, letting the words wash over her like water she was used to wading through. "Your mom's not wrong," she said gently. "But sometimes you don't speak because you want to win. You speak so the next kid doesn't have to fight the same fight alone." The streetlight above them buzzed, once flickered, then held steady, casting a warm, amber glow across the sidewalk. Rochelle looked up at it for a moment, then back at DeAndre, who was still staring forward, eyes lost in the middle distance. "You think it's gonna change?" he asked. "Like, really change? Or are they just gonna pretend for a while, then go back to how it was?" She didn't lie. She never did, not to herself, and not to him. "It won't all change," she said. "Not overnight, not in one case. But this cracked something open that can't be closed again. And that's how real change starts, with cracks, not fireworks. He nodded again, slower this time, as if giving himself permission to believe her just a little. The silence returned, but this time it felt fuller, less like avoidance, and more like understanding. Rochelle stood after a while, brushing the dust from the back of her coat, then turned to him. "You did more than you know," she said. "And you'll keep doing more just by being here, by living." He looked up at her eyes a little wider now, as if seeing her for the first time, not as an agent, not as someone on television, but as someone who had been pushed up against a wall and chose to rise instead of retreat. "Thanks," he said simply, and meant it. She gave him one final nod, then walked back toward her car, the sun now completely down, the first stars beginning to cut through the thin veil of dusk above. As she reached the driver's side, she paused again, hand on the handle, and looked out across the neighborhood windows, lit in soft gold, a screen door creaking somewhere, wind stirring the leaves in uneven rhythm. And in that moment, Rochelle didn't think about the trials ahead or the backlash that was already bubbling beneath the surface. She didn't worry about the cameras, the politics, or the systems that would fight tooth and nail to protect their own. What she felt quietly and completely was something simpler, a shift in the weight of the world. A soft, irrevocable movement of truth reclaiming its place. And that was enough. The station walls had always felt too thick, old brick painted over so many times that they no longer reflected light, only held it like secrets. On that particular morning, they didn't just hold light. They held tension, like a room that had finally overheard its own lies and didn't know what to do with the silence that followed. Officers moved through the hallways a little slower than usual, avoiding eye contact, offering greetings that barely registered above a whisper. Someone had brought donuts, but the box sat unopened on the edge of the breakroom counter, as untouched as the empty chairs that surrounded it. And at the center of it all, Darren Stokes sat behind his desk, fingers drumming restlessly against a case file that had nothing to do with what was really weighing on his mind. The silence hadn't started as fear. It had started as confusion, uncertainty about how much people knew, how much they'd seen, whether the rumors were just smoke or something far closer to fire. But now, after the press conference, after the witness testimony, after Rochelle Turner had stood in front of the city and peeled back the veil with a surgeon's steadiness, fear had taken root. Not panic, not yet, but a growing understanding that the tide had shifted and he was no longer walking with the current, he was standing against it. He looked around the room, eyes landing briefly on a few familiar faces, officers he had once trusted, men and women who had laughed at his jokes, backed his reports, ignored his temper. But something had changed in their posture. They still nodded when he passed, still said his name, but they said it softer now, with a kind of caution, as if saying it too loud might make them complicit. Down the hall, Chief Monroe's door was closed, blinds drawn, and everyone knew she was in contact with the DOJ. Every morning now, conference calls that lasted longer than they used to, names being reviewed, case logs being pulled from storage. He told himself he wasn't worried, told himself they wouldn't have the guts to come after him without hard proof. But something in the back of his mind kept repeating Rochelle's words, the ones she had said just before he shoved her against the wall. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." At the time, he'd laughed. Now it echoed in his head like a warning bell. Meanwhile, Rochelle wasn't thinking about Darren Stokes, not directly anyway. She was sitting in her small field office near the courthouse, going over the last statement from a retired sergeant who had come forward unexpectedly after seeing the footage on the local news. The man's voice had shaken during the interview, not from guilt but from the weight of everything he hadn't said for decades. "I told myself I was protecting the badge," he'd whispered, "but I was just protecting the people who tarnished it." Rochelle had thanked him quietly without judgment. And now she played the recording again, headphones over her ears, listening not just to his words, but to the pauses between them, those long, trembling silences that revealed more than any confession. It was those spaces that told her they were close, not to a headline, but to a rupture. Outside her window, the streets were alive with movement, kids on their way to school, shop owners unlocking gates, buses exhaling at every corner. The city didn't look different, but it felt different. More alert, more aware. The quiet fear that had settled over places like Eastwood was giving way to something sharper, anger maybe, or just the will to speak after so long being told to be still. By early afternoon, Rochelle had one more stop to make. She walked into the city records department, badge clipped to her blazer, asking for a set of employment files linked to the old training academy. The clerk hesitated, then nodded, returning a few minutes later with a manila folder, thick with forms and signatures. One by one, she scanned the records, matching timelines, looking for the missing piece in a puzzle she'd nearly completed. And then she found it buried at the bottom, a disciplinary referral that had been flagged but never followed up on, involving an early complaint against Stokes during his second year on patrol. The supervising officer had signed off with a single line handled internally. She closed the folder slowly, the corners of her mouth drawing tight, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of grim clarity. They had always known, from the beginning. He hadn't slipped through the cracks. He had been protected from the start. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the skyline, Rochelle walked the long way back to her car, letting the day stretch around her like a weight she could finally feel herself beginning to carry differently. Not heavier, not lighter, just closer to done. She passed by the courthouse steps, now quiet again, and stopped for a moment, hand resting on the rail. A teenager walked by with earbuds in, glanced at her, then paused. "You're the one from the hearing, right?" he asked. Rochelle turned, nodding once. "That was me." The boy shifted his backpack, nodded back. "Cool." "It mattered," he said, then walked on, music bleeding faintly from his headphones into the open air. Rochelle stood there for a moment longer, then finally moved again, footsteps steady on the pavement. The truth wasn't just public now. It was personal, carried in glances, in nods, in the spaces where silence used to live. And that, she thought, as the wind rustled the flags outside the building, was how change begins to root itself, not in declarations, but in the things people carry forward when no one's watching. Sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come from shouting, it comes from standing your ground when the world expects you to stay silent. Rochelle's journey reminds us that truth doesn't always arrive in dramatic moments. It arrives quietly, through courage, through the decision to speak up even when it's uncomfortable, and through the quiet refusal to look away when something is wrong. For those of us who have seen years pass and know what it means to carry history in our bones, we understand the value of accountability, not for revenge, but for healing. This story teaches us that no matter how long injustice hides, it can't survive when people choose to step forward with dignity, with clarity, and with the strength to be seen. So if you've ever felt like your voice doesn't matter, remember this: it's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to stand up for what's right, and sometimes your quiet strength is the loudest thing in the room. If this story moved, you don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes in justice. Your voice helps these stories reach those who need them most.